Ooh, what's this? A new video on my channel without a 6-month break in between? Wow. Not gonna lie, I've been super excited about making this video. So much so that it's actually going to be the first in a multi-part series. I wanted it to be one video, but the script kept getting longer and longer, so I'm breaking it up into 3, maybe 4 parts. And what am I talking about that will apparently take months to talk about? Well, I'm doing a compare and contrast for the book Howl's Moving Castle and its movie adaptation. So let's get into part 1 of how the book and movie are different and similar. Firstly, of course, welcome back to my channel. If you're new, welcome. Grab a seat and hang out for a bit. I'm Pixie and I love to draw and talk about things. And oh boy, can I talk about Howl's Moving Castle. My partner can actually attest to how often I tell him about the differences between the book and the movie. Again, this video is now a planned series of videos, and I will try to keep everything as coherent as I can. Of course, there are also major spoilers ahead for both the book and the movie, so if you haven't read or watched either and want to, go do that now and then come back. Otherwise, let's step through the magic door into the land of Ingary and Howl's Moving Castle. So the novel was published in April 1986, and it was written by the incredible Diana Wynne Jones, and is actually part of a trilogy. The other 2 books are Castle in the Air, not related to Studio Ghibli's Castle in the Sky, and House of Many Ways. The movie was released in the fall of 2004 by Studio Ghibli and was directed by the equally incredible Hayao Miyazaki. Both the book and the movie have a lot of the same elements. Most of the characters are the same, and the setting is the same. However, the actual stories are pretty much completely different from each other, and even the characters are quite different in both versions. Some more than others. Again, this is going to be a series, so for this video, I'll be talking about the setting, including the castle, and Sophie and her family. So starting with the setting. Both stories take place in the magical land of Ingary, where things like 7-league boots and invisibility cloaks are real. I don't think the movie ever actually says the name of the land, but the towns of Porthaven and Kingsbury are in both stories, and the waste exists in both as well. We never actually see the waste in the movie, unless it's just not obvious. In the book, Sophie does end up going to the waste to face the Witch of the Waste, and it's this vast, boiling desert with no life or greenery or anything. In the movie, it's more just something characters mention in passing. Back to the similarities, both stories do open on Sophie's family's hat shop in the town of Market Shipping. Once again, the movie doesn't give us this name, but that's really not a big deal. The titular castle is also, of course, a huge part of the setting, and much of the story takes place inside the castle in both versions. In the book, we're told that the castle interior is actually just the house in Porthaven, whereas the movie makes it seem like the interior is physically in the castle with portals to Porthaven and Kingsbury. The interior design looks fairly similar in both book and movie, with some minor differences. Namely, there's a small backyard that's walled in, and the bathroom is actually downstairs instead of upstairs. But the glaringly biggest difference between the book castle and the movie castle is the exterior design. Now, I absolutely adore the movie castle's design. I love its face and little chicken-looking legs, and the movie really gave the castle its own personality in a way. In the book, the outer design is entirely different and very imposing. It's this tall, thin, heavy, ugly, sinister building made of cobbled-together black stones with lots of chimneys spewing black smoke. Sophie's amazed the castle doesn't just fall apart. It also doesn't have legs. The whole building, which is described as far too tall for its height and not a very regular shape, just sort of glides and lumbers around the countryside, the stones shifting and shaking as it moves. The castle also has several exterior doors, but all but one are covered by an invisible barrier that actually blocks them off. This barrier also keeps people from being able to go around the left side of the castle, and ends up leading Sophie to the only real door. And that's pretty much it for the differences between the castles. Now, let's talk about some of the characters. Again, for this video, I'm focusing on Sophie and her family, as Sophie is the main protagonist of both versions of the story. In both the book and the movie, Sophie starts out as a pretty anxious and shy woman. The book tells us she's 18, and she spends most of her time talking to the hats she trims for her family's hat shop. She doesn't really seem to have any friends, and the other workers in the hat shop are much older than she is, so she mostly just keeps to herself. Sophie is also the eldest of 3 sisters, and because she is the eldest, if she decides to leave home to seek her fortune, she will be doomed to fail, which does nothing for her self-confidence. This is also a book-only detail, and Sophie is actually the only character that ever says she's doomed to fail because she is the eldest. No one ever brings up this point. Now, Sophie's dad also owned and ran the hat shop, and had Sophie and Letty with his first wife, who passed away when Sophie was 2 and Letty was 1. Mr. Hatter would go on to marry his youngest shop assistant, Fanny, and she would eventually give birth to Martha. Now, the 3 sisters get along quite well, though Sophie does have to break up a lot of fights between Letty and Martha growing up, and she often finds herself mending and making clothes for them. Now, in the movie, Fanny is replaced by Honey. We don't actually get her name, that's what the wiki calls her. And I also don't think she's Sophie's stepmother, as Sophie calls her mother in the movie, but in the book, Sophie calls her Fanny. And while Letty is a character in both the book and movie, Martha doesn't exist in the movie. She does get name-dropped early in the movie, I think, as someone whose heart might have been eaten by Howl. And later, when Sophie first sets out after being cursed, she does say she's heading towards the waste in search of her younger sister. So we do get some references to Martha, which I really like. Now, on the topic of Letty and Martha, when Mr. Hatter passes away, Fanny sets Martha and Letty up in apprenticeships. Letty ends up going to the bakery, called Cessary's in the book, and Martha goes to study magic with a respected and well-known witch named Mrs. Fairfax. The sisters aren't super happy with these placements. Letty would much rather learn magic and use her brain, and Martha wants to eventually find herself a husband and have like 10 kids. So they end up switching places using a spell to disguise themselves as each other. Though Mrs. Fairfax sees right through Letty's disguise, having made the spell the girls used, and tells Letty that she can stay and study there, but she will do so as herself. Meanwhile, Martha is still disguised as and going by the name Letty. The spell is designed to gradually fade, so she will slowly become herself again, but she does stay as Letty for a good portion of the book. Now, I'm talking a lot about Sophie's family right now, because while they are supporting characters, they're integral to a good chunk of the book's plot. We only see Fanny or Honey twice in the movie, and only see Letty once. But all 3 characters are in a lot of the first couple of chapters, and come up several times throughout the book, including being there for some of the end conflict. They still have very little screen time, but without them, much of the book's plot would just be gone. I do really like also that Letty in the movie looks a bit like how Martha is described in the book. Letty has dark hair and Martha has fair hair and gray eyes. Letty's might be blue in the movie, but the description is still pretty close and feels like another fun nod to Martha and Letty switching places, so that's pretty cool. But back to Sophie. Fanny decides that it makes the most sense for Sophie to inherit the hat shop someday, and Sophie resigns herself to that fate. She wants adventure and excitement, but is far too anxious for that. Not to mention her belief that she would just fail if she tried to do anything other than make hats. In both the book and the movie, Sophie decides to go out and visit her sister at Cessary's bakery on May Day. In the book, she actually tries several times to go see Letty/Martha, but is unable to until the May Day celebrations. Now, in both versions, market shipping is filled to the brim with crowds of people celebrating with parades and loud merrymaking. Even the castle seems to get in on it in the book, shooting fireworks of some sort out of its chimneys. Now, there is one major difference here, and this difference is a big part of what drives the plot of the movie, but is only mentioned as a possibility in the book. The movie's main conflict is the war that's waging between Ingri and another kingdom. But in the book, there are only a few passing remarks on a possible war looming. Now, it makes sense that Miyazaki would choose to make war the central conflict in this movie, as he, of course, is very anti-war, and the movie was released in 2004. So Miyazaki had wanted to make a movie essentially condemning the war in Iraq at the time, and he also felt that whatever movie he did make would be received poorly in the US. And these sorts of themes are pretty usual for Studio Ghibli films, be it taking care of the earth, being against war and conflict, stuff like that. But this does change up a lot of how the characters in this movie act and interact with each other, compared to the book. For instance, Sophie's first interaction with Howl is completely different in both versions. In the book, when Sophie's on her way to Cessaries, she runs into a rather fancy-looking young man. She would later find out this is Howl. And he calls her a little gray mouse and tells her she's pretty and asks if he can buy her a drink. And then he offers to escort her to the bakery as she seems to be pretty freaked out by the crowds. Sophie, overwhelmed by the crowds and embarrassed at being pitied by some rando, declines his offers and basically just runs away from him. Meanwhile, in the movie, Sophie is accosted by two soldiers in an alleyway on her way to Cessaries. In another fun reference to the book, these soldiers actually call her a little mouse. And then, of course, here, Howl just kind of shows up out of nowhere, saying he's been looking for Sophie, and he uses his magic to send the soldiers off. And then he just starts escorting Sophie to Cessaries, without really any prompting. Now we get another pretty big difference here from the book, and that is these weird goo people that start following Howl and Sophie through the town. We later find out that these are the Witch of the Wast's henchmen, though they are also used by another movie character that I'll talk about in another video. Now these goo guys pop up a few times in the movie, but don't actually exist in the book. The witch doesn't really have a need for henchmen in the book. She's perfectly fine with getting her own hands dirty. But I do like the goo dudes. They're pretty unsettling and very well designed. Anyway, so Sophie's reaction to meeting Howl in the book and movie are vastly different too. In the book, she just kind of brushes off the encounter, not really thinking about it again until she officially meets Howl after she's been cursed. And then she thinks to herself that she really dodged a bullet by running away from the supposed evil wizard. In the movie, after Howl flies her to Cessaries and floats her down to the balcony, I'm pretty sure she's already smitten with Howl. Though she's not convinced the man even was Howl, claiming he was too nice to be the heart-eating wizard. She also says that even if it was Howl, she doesn't have anything to worry about, as Howl only goes after pretty girls. Book Sophie is timid and doesn't think much of herself, but movie Sophie turns the dial on the low confidence up quite a bit. But then, of course, the Witch of the Waste in all of her super petty and jealous glory comes into Sophie's shop and goes, "Nah, you're too pretty, and you're in my way. Bam, now you're old." That's not actually what she says, but she does say Sophie is in her way in both the movie and the book, and of course this is where Sophie's curse comes in. Her reaction to suddenly being old is pretty much the same in both versions. She starts out fairly freaked out, but comes to terms with it pretty quickly. In the movie, she first thinks it's a bad dream and tries to sleep it off before ultimately deciding to leave home. In the book, she actually leaves right away, just reasoning that she can't let her family see her like that. In both versions, she already feels like an old woman and feels that this curse suits her more than being young, and she starts to open up a bit more, generally talking to herself and everything around her quite a lot. And I just realized I haven't actually talked about Sophie's physical description yet. In the book, young Sophie has long red-gold hair and blue-green eyes, and old Sophie is thin and gaunt with withered brownish skin and wispy white hair. If you've seen the movie, you know young Sophie has long brown hair and dark eyes, while old Sophie is short and stout and her hair isn't quite wispy, but it is shorter and white, and it ends up staying white even after the curse is broken. In the book, her appearance returns to exactly what it was before the curse. Now Sophie, as an old lady of about 90 years old in both the movie and the book, is sassy as heck and gives not a single F about it. Book Sophie, however, is about 1,000 times more sassy and no F's given, and she is not afraid to give people a piece of her mind. She often tells Howl where to go and bullies poor Calcifer in the first bit of her stay in the castle. Another example of her sass in the book comes from when Howl sends her to blacken his name to the king, so he won't have to do what the king wants him to do. In the book, Sophie actually talks to the king. In the movie, she talks to Madame Solomon, who is two completely different characters in the book, who have been mashed together into one person. But again, that's for another video. But anyway, this meeting with the king gives us probably my favorite character description from Sophie in the entire book. And there's a lot of really good ones. In chapter 13, pages 242 and 243, when Sophie first sees the king, this is the description we get. He was quite alone, like an ordinary person. True, he sat with one leg thrust out in a kingly sort of manner, and he was handsome in a plump, slightly vague way. But to Sophie, he seemed quite youthful and just a touch too proud of being king. She felt he ought, with that face, to have been more unsure of himself. Like, wow, Sophie, tell us how you really feel. She also does not let Howl get away with BSing her or constantly dodging her questions, though I'll get into Howl more in the next video. She's also so stubborn and super jealous of a lot of Howl's potential love interests throughout the book, though she refuses to admit that she's in love with him right up until pretty much the end of the book. She realizes her feelings much sooner in the movie. Sophie in the movie is actually just quite lovely. She's kind and sweet and adores Howl. And yes, she does start off as quite a fierce, kind of rage-filled older lady, but she fairly quickly softens into a more grandmotherly character, which is hilarious considering there's a scene in the book where she throws a bucket of very strong weed killer straight at Howl's head. Once she's cursed in the book, she's fiery, sassy, and even more fiercely protective of those she cares about, and even cares about characters she dislikes at times, except for the Witch of the Waste. Both versions absolutely loathe the witch, though the movie does sort of redeem the witch in a way, kind of, and Sophie ends up caring for her like she's the main cast's senile grandmother, which she essentially becomes in the movie. At one point in the book, Sophie has told herself that she's a pretty powerful witch in her own right. She has the ability to talk life into things, and she is completely unbothered by this information, deciding that she kind of always knew she was, but never really thought about it before. And it makes a lot of sense that she can do this. While working on hats, she'd tell the hat what kind of person will wear it, and all of these predictions, I guess you could call them, come true, and even the Witch of the Waste could tell what the hats were charmed for when she comes into the shop the first time. Sophie also talked life into the turnip-headed scarecrow in the book, and accidentally charms one of Howl's suits while mending it, telling it was made to draw in the girls. She then proceeds to do everything she can to get Howl out of this particular suit so she can cut it up into several pieces and hide it from him. And this magical gift is also possibly what's keeping Sophie under the curse. In the movie, Howl asks Sophie how she could possibly help him when she can't even break her own curse. And in the book, he straight up tells her he's tried removing the curse several times, but figured she must just like being disguised as she's doing it to herself. And Sophie already thinks being old suits her and that she will never amount to anything, so she's inadvertently keeping herself old and doesn't even realize it. You can really see it in the movie as there are several instances where Sophie de-ages by a few years, and even times where she fully becomes young again. Now, Sophie is ultimately the one who breaks her curse in the end. Though she doesn't actually cut her hair for Calcifer to move the castle out of the hat shop, there's no need for the move in the book, and the castle actually stays connected to it in the book. And like I mentioned before, Sophie's hair also doesn't stay white or silver. It reverts back to its original red-gold color, which Howl absolutely adores. And Sophie also does, of course, break Howl and Calcifer's contract in both stories. Though the book tells us why she's the only one who could do it, her ability to talk life into things, of course means that there is no doubt that both Howl and Calcifer will survive the contract ending. If anybody else had done it, they probably would have both died. In the book, Sophie, I think, actually plucks Calcifer off of Howl's heart before putting the heart back into Howl, telling Calcifer that she hopes he lives for thousands more years. In the movie, I think Calcifer is actually still attached to Howl's heart until after Sophie puts Howl's heart back. Not really a big difference, but it is there. She also has to take the heart from the Witch of the Waste in the movie, but a different character gets her hands on Howl's heart in the book. But again, that's for another video. Now, this is the part of the video where I would switch to talking about Howl. But again, this video is already probably pretty long, and I have just so much more I want to talk about on this topic, so I'll be diving into more characters in the next video, and we'll just have to wait and see how long this series ends up being. I'm pretty sure I got everything for Sophie, but she's most likely going to come up in other videos too, so if I forgot anything, I'll probably include it later. And with that, we've reached the end of part 1 of my Howl's Moving Castle series. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've made it to the end, drop a star emoji in the comments down below and let me know what you thought about the book or the movie, if you watched or read it. I want to thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. October's is going to be a spooky one, and part 2 of this series will be out in November, so stay tuned for those. Thanks again so much for hanging out. You're all wicked awesome. And I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.